Okay, so this is our Simon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention. We have a little bit of uncertainty about the page where we left off last time for some annoying reasons that we don't need to get into, but we've determined that we're pretty sure we're at the top of page 175. So that's where we're going to start from if anyone is following along, 175 in the translation. So last time we looked at, let's see, we're still in part 4, and within part 4 we're on section 1, the creation of technical objects, and so again this is connected with his other book on the mode of existence of technical objects that we read a few years ago, and one of the key ideas that he develops in that work and that he's sort of pointing at it here without I think using the exact term that he introduces there is this notion of concretization. So I don't think he uses that term in this text, but he's pretty clearly pointing to that concept. And so this, for Simon, concretization is how technical progress happens. So how something that is at a more sort of primitive state of technical development becomes more technically sophisticated is this notion of concretization. And what this means essentially is that a technical object is more concrete insofar as its components each contribute multiple functions to the functioning of the whole. So a more abstract technical object has each component, each part of the technical object has one determined function, and so it just sort of contributes one function, and then any other effects that it has on other parts of the technical object are like sort of undesired noise or friction or things like that. Whereas in more concrete technical objects, all of these effects, all of the different interactions between the parts are incorporated into the functioning of the whole technical object. So it minimizes the role of sort of undesired interactions between the parts, friction and noise and anything along those lines. So one of the examples that he gives in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects is this kind of turbine that uses the water to so the turbine, of course, turns as a result of the water pressure, and then it also uses the water for cooling at the same time. So and I don't remember all the details. I'd have to check the book again. But so instead of having just one function of turning the turbine, the water plays a cooling role at the same time. So it's not there are multiple different functions that the one component of the technical object are playing at the same time. And another example is in the case of internal combustion engines. I think I mentioned this last time. So early internal combustion engines had like a radiator or some other means of dissipating heat so that the engine doesn't overheat and seize up. So this can be like an air radiator, so it just dissipates heat into the air, or a water radiator where water flows over the engine and absorbs heat and then dissipates it. But in any case, the radiator just contributes a certain amount of heat dissipation. So you can essentially substitute the radiator with any other object that dissipates the same amount of heat, and it doesn't really change the functioning of the engine. But then in more concrete, more sophisticated internal combustion engines, the cylinders themselves have instead of just being pure geometrical cylinders, they have veins built into them, so like little outcroppings, I guess. And what this does is, first, it increases the surface area of the cylinder, so it means that the cylinder can dissipate heat more effectively. And then second, the shape of the cylinder now with these outcroppings is actually structurally stronger than the pure cylindrical structure. And what that means in turn is that you can get a cylinder with the same strength using a thinner wall of the cylinder, and that again allows for more heat dissipation. So these veins in the wall of the cylinder serve a structural function and a heat dissipation function, and then the structural function also contributes to heat dissipation in turn. So they have a sort of multifunctional role. And Simondon compares this to the way that a living organism functions. So in a living organism, there are organs that are specialized in various functions, but at the same time, each organ has multiple different functions within the functioning of the body, and the way that that it interacts with all the other organs and systems in the body is more than just contributing one sort of isolated function. And so this is why it's very difficult to create like synthetic organs, for example, to produce something, a device that can play all the roles that the heart or the kidneys or whatever play in the human body is much more difficult than just reproducing one function. And so again, the concrete technical object approximates to the living object. It never quite reaches it for Simondon, but it sort of heads in that direction. So we saw a few examples or a few passages discussing these types of relationships in the last session. So we looked at the arch as an example of this concretization. So in an arch, each stone, Simondon describes it as each stone playing the role of wall and ceiling at the same time. So instead of having one portion of the structure which serves as vertical support, like a wall, and then another portion of the structure that serves as a sort of covering or protection against the elements. Instead, you have each component of the wall, each stone that makes up the arch, has both functions at the same time. It contributes both vertical and horizontal structural forces to the functioning of the arch. And the arch is sort of another aspect of concretization that is exemplified by the arch, because the arch is sort of self reinforcing in the sense that the action of gravity, instead of sort of pulling down the arch, like in the case of a structure with a wall and ceiling, the action of gravity actually pulls the stones closer together because of the shape of the stones. So the action of gravity makes the arch cohere more and be more stable. And again, this is characteristic of concrete technical objects in general. So because an abstract technical object has all these undesired interactions between the components, like friction and so on, it means that the functioning of that object tends to destroy that object over time. And then you have to sort of mitigate that by introducing things like radiators. Whereas a more concrete technical object, because all the different elements of each component are incorporated into the functioning of the object, it has less of a tendency to destroy itself. It becomes more sort of self-sustaining. And so this is and so what the lesson that we sort of draw from this, according to Simondon, is that there's a kind of individuation process of a technical object as it becomes more concrete. So it becomes more and more of an individual, a sort of self-subsistent reality that doesn't depend on being sort of protected from its own functioning in the way that an abstract technical object does. And then I think the last thing I'll mention here is this sort of more, so after some passages of more sort of technical description, we get this more philosophical passage where Simondon uses the term dialectics again, and we've sort of commented on this a few times throughout the readings that we've been doing, that Simondon has a sort of ambiguous relationship with the term dialectics. He sometimes calls his own philosophy dialectical, other times he criticizes what he calls dialectics. But here he does describe his own work as dialectical, or he criticizes other views as non-dialectical. So this is just another passage that we can sort of point to when we want to understand the relationship between Simondon and dialectics. And that makes a good transition to the next bit that we're going to start with today, because he's going to talk about Marx. And of course, there's the whole question of dialectics in Marxism. So if I can get someone to read from page 175, the first full paragraph on 175, and yeah, just read like I guess onto 177 because it's like one of these long paragraphs.
I can read. Moreover, this amplification effect through the recruitment of natural effects within technical invention has practical and social consequences that parallel its theoretical consequences. The mechanism of economic surplus value that Marx describes in Capital expresses, in the sphere of human work, one of the consequences of the implementation of technical inventions that enabled the Industrial Revolution. This means that the labor of worker operators was incorporated in the schema of inventions and was recruited as a natural effect. But the amplification effect is not restricted to the domain of operator labor. It is merely visible in a privileged way in this domain, a particular case greatly concerning human societies. Nor is amplifying dialectical evolution only human, social, and political. It characterizes the entire domain of objects created by invention, not only in their relation with human society, but also in their relation with nature. Through the intermediary of created objects, the relationship of humans to nature is subjected to an amplifying dialectical evolution, whose active grounding lies in invention, effectively expressing the cycle of the image by the expansion of the terminal phase of creative invention outside of the individual. A complete study of the applications of this conception of the technical object created by invention exceeds the scope of this study of quote-unquote general psychology, for not only the consequences, but also the conditions of the genesis of an invention imply collective contents and historical aspects, together with the specific way in which knowledge and power are transmitted in the form of constituted objects or of production processes, and with the exigencies of the conditions of reception, which are not just economical but cultural. See on the mode of existence of technical objects. Louis-Goron has studied phenomena of diffusion, transmission, and transposition of techniques within the framework of ethnology, with complex phenomena such as those occurring when a population is presented with objects displaying a more advanced development than its own, metal tools imported into a stone tool culture, in L'homme et la matière, man and matter, and milieu et technique, milieus and techniques. From this point of view, our societies have posed the problem of the relation of recurrent information between the producer and the consumer, who is in truth an operator-user and not a consumer when it comes to technical objects. A complete market study in this area should include the study of an invention's distribution channels, since a technical object carries in itself both implicit and explicit information about its conditions of use and the choice of models. Conversely, the finalization of the features of a model by a manufacturer is a study not only of intrinsic but also of extrinsic compatibility, since it entails the adaptation of the object to a system of virtual uses that do not at all correspond to a univocal concept. Accordingly, in the rural French milieu of small farms mixing polyculture, farming, and livestock, efficient production using agricultural machinery has long confronted a lack of adaptation of machines to the actual functions of labor. These machines, particularly tractors, were conceived in relation to an ideal use in flat areas with monoculture farming in large contiguous fields, since such regions had been the first to cross the economical threshold of industrial machinery. The tractor was reinvented after 1950 in France for regions of polyculture farming on small or mid-sized farms, and was quickly adopted, showing that, for the most part, it was not a matter of prejudice to be overcome or economic conditions yet to be obtained. In its new form, the tractor is no longer just agricultural, made to pull a plow, but becomes all at once a stationary generator of motive power, a road-ready vehicle with tires and higher speed, and a universal support for tools directly fed with the mechanical power from the engine, creating a close compatibility between the towing effect and the power source effect. The invention of an intrinsic mode of compatibility between these two effects made the extrinsic compatibility possible by adapting the multifunctional tractor to a continuous spectrum of uses, from either traction or engine power to both simultaneously. A similar study could be conducted on the automobile market in France. The failure of some models, the Renault Baguette, is not caused by technical deficiencies, but by a deficiency of knowing with respect to its necessary extrinsic compatibility, in particular its dual purposes, transporting people and things. The success of the 4L model conversely corresponds to a good study of the plurality of needs. More generally, the perfecting of a technical object in the direction of concretization in the enhancement of its level of internal compatibility produces an external adaptability that is termed quote-unquote versatile in the US and may be compared to flexibility in the sense of the word in psychology. The multifunctionality of uses corresponds to one of the essential functions of an invention as a creator of compatibility. The fact that an invention is a creator of objects plays an essential role here, since an object can be a real synthesis, while the concepts of use and finality, univocal and limited, remain abstract. They enable the organization of the production of a thing towards a pre-established end, but not the creation of an object as a materialization of an image, as a continuous spectrum linking extreme terms like the tractor and the engine, or the car meant to transport people, and the car meant to transport merchandise. The object can totalize and condense information gatherings that express needs, desires, and expectations. The recurrent circulation of information between production and virtual use makes the image and the created object communicate directly, enabling a compatibilizing invention, while a conceptual definition according to finality deploys only a single function abstraction, eschewing invention. For the same reason, a purely economic study of the genesis and use of technical objects is insufficient, since it does not account for their mode of existence, which is a result of an invention condensing in one object a sheaf of information contained in the reality of an image that has reached the end of its becoming. Yeah, Simondon knows a lot, but I think he could stand to, take a class on like basic writing compositions stuff, just to learn to break up his paragraphs every once in a while. But at least what I got out of this section is that one of the essential aspects of the created object is that it has this virtual excess, which I guess internally plays out in terms of this concretization process, and externally it has an external role as well, which unites, I guess, disparate virtual compatibilities, like the way that the same vehicle can be used to transport people and to transport things. And also, it's broader than just a kind of economic surplus because of its psychological origin, or psychological and material origin, I guess.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things in this paragraph, or these couple paragraphs, that we probably won't be able to cover everything. But one of the things that he sort of alludes to, he doesn't really make this explicit, but he points to on the mode of existence of technical objects. He criticizes classification of technical objects in terms of their uses. So, like, for example, if you take technical objects in terms of uses, you would say like that a mechanical clock and a digital clock are both examples of a use of telling the time. But in terms of the actual functioning of these objects, of course, they're completely different. And Simondon points out that a mechanical clock actually has a closer resemblance to a crossbow in terms of the functioning than it does to a digital clock. So this classification in terms of uses sort of cuts across the grain of the real functioning of the technical objects. The technical essence is the term that he uses. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the use of the technical object is irrelevant. Obviously, technical objects are produced to be used in certain ways, and that use, it sort of feeds back into the design of the technical object. So then, when you're looking at the history of technical objects, you have to evaluate not just sort of a internal criterion of like how sophisticated or how good is this technical object just in isolation, but you have to look at how it's adapted to the circumstances in which it's going to be distributed. So he gives the example in this section of the tractor. So early tractors are designed primarily for the American market, where you have like big farms in the prairies, in the plains, that are primarily used for plowing and harvesting grain. So you have monoculture, one single crop on big flat fields, and the tractor is adapted to this kind of environment, and it's successful in this environment. But then in France, instead of this type of farm, you have instead much smaller farms that grow multiple different crops, and the landscape is much less flat, and the fields might be separated. They might be like, instead of having one giant field, you have a bunch of small fields. So the early tractors are not really suitable for this kind of environment, and so you have to adapt the functioning of the tractor to enable it to play multiple roles, that instead of just having this sort of pulling a plow function, it now can serve a variety of different functions, and it does this not just by sort of adding a bunch of, it's not like a Swiss Army knife where you just have like a bunch of different tools in one sort of convenient container. It's the tractor, the functioning of the tractor has to be sort of made more flexible so that it can be used in multiple different ways. And so this is like the other side of the more sort of external side of the development of a technical object, is this sort of enhanced flexibility. And you can see this maybe also in the camera example that we saw a couple sessions ago, in the sense that the more sophisticated scientific camera is also more flexible than the sort of mass-produced camera that is used by tourists. The tourist camera can only take pictures under sort of average lighting and average distance of the object from the camera, whereas the scientific camera has much more flexibility in terms of lighting, distance, etc. So this is like a sort of adaptation to more circumstances that will be part of how the technical object evolves. And of course, it depends on the exact circumstances in the environment, like what is this object used for? What sort of role does the object have to play in various aspects of social and economic life? And that sort of feeds back on the design of the newer versions of the object, like in the case of the tractor, where the early tractors are not being sold. Farmers don't have much use for them in France, and then so that sort of feeds back on the design of the object, and then it is made to be more flexible so that it can actually find use in France. And then maybe like another important point here is that he points out that the resistance to the tractor in France, or the lack of enthusiasm for the tractor in France, you might suggest like one sort of easy explanation would just be to say, oh, these French peasants or French farmers on these small farms are conservative and reactionary. They don't like understand, or they're afraid of progress or afraid of technology or whatever. But of course, the fact that a few years later they do adopt a tractor once its design is adapted to their circumstances shows that it wasn't like technology as such that they were opposed to. It was the form of the technical object that was not suitable for their circumstances. So this sort of easy form of explanation in terms of sort of cultural, ideological aspects that sort of prevent the diffusion of an object. A lot of the time, this explanation is like too simplistic. Even if there may be some truth to it in certain cases, there may be resistance to technical objects just out of like a fear of change or something like that. But it in general is not enough to sort of explain why a certain technical object didn't get diffused in a certain region, just to say that, oh, people are afraid of change. And maybe if I can add to this isn't like directly in what Simondon is saying here, but I would suggest that like if you appeal to this kind of cultural explanation and say people are afraid of change or whatever, I mean, people everywhere in all times are somewhat afraid of change or afraid of certain kinds of change. and then in other respects, they're also, excited about change and, want certain kinds of change. But the question is always like, what is it about this particular change that makes some people that makes it more frightening or more exciting, or like, why is it that in this particular time and place that the fear of change wins out, and then some other time and place the enthusiasm for change wins out. So you have to look at it like at the particular level. You can't just appeal to like a general fear of change because that would apply to any situation, and so it doesn't like differentiate between the places where the change is accepted and places where it's not accepted. So I think what Simondon is sort of pointing towards is a more differentiated historical analysis of the diffusion of technical objects and the way that diffusion feeds back on the design of a technical object. So you have to look at individual times and places and sort of analyze, why this technical object that was maybe more sophisticated in certain respects didn't win out, and one that was less sophisticated ended up being much more popular. So like a sort of classic example of this is the VHS versus Betamax competition in the 1980s. So these were two different formats for video recording. Of course, most people will be familiar with VHS as or people who are as old as I am, I guess, will be familiar with VHS. And so in certain technical respects, Beta was actually superior to VHS in terms of like picture quality and so on. But it was Sony that produced it, and they didn't want to license the format to any other companies. They essentially only Sony could use this Beta format. Whereas VHS, I forget who actually developed it, but they allowed other companies to use the VHS format, and that meant that there were just many more VHS tapes available. You could get like any movie you wanted, and not just Sony movies on VHS. And so even though Beta was superior in certain technical respects, the sort of diffusion of it meant that VHS ended up winning out, and Beta was discontinued after a couple of years. And so like the choice between Beta and VHS was not based just on like purely technical factors like how much fidelity or like the image quality or sound quality or anything like that. It would have to do with the economic factors of the distribution system as well. And there was a similar type of competition between Blu-ray and HD DVDs. Obviously, they're both semi-obsolete at this point. Again, you had the competing formats, and the decision between the two had to do as much with the distribution networks that they were part of as it did with the actual technical differences between the formats.
This idea of the technical object needing to not perfectly align with the finality of the concept kind of reminds me of the critique of judgment and the points that Kant makes in that book about how a work of art can't be made in accordance with a determinate rule. I know there are very different things going on here, but I don't know, maybe we could see the work of art for Kant as needing this kind of indeterminate virtual reserve in a similar way to how Simondon thinks that this capacity for concretization or external relations is necessary for the technical object.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison. I think maybe the way I would make the connection is in terms of invention. Like there's a role of creativity in both the production of an artwork and the production of a new technical object. And precisely because there's this creativity involved, you can't have a rule for how to do either one. Like you can't say here's how to invent a technical object. You can give like sort of pointers of like how to sort of spark creativity. You can also give lots of technical knowledge about like how electronics work and things like that that will help you in developing your invention, but like you can't give a rule for like this is how to invent a new technical object. In the same way that you can't give a rule for how to create an artwork. Like you have like some like famous authors write texts about like how to write or whatever, but like you can't just sort of study that text and follow its precepts and then become a great writer. You have to have some new idea or some creativity of your own. And so I think in both cases, like there's the creativity aspect. It means you're actually creating something new and not just sort of following a pre-established rule to create something following a preset pattern.
Actually, like as I missed like a lot of like the a lot of sessions, so probably like I'm missing the point. But my question is that here technical objects are limited to something tangible and visible. Cause like I thought of the case of Viagra, like that medicine by Pfizer actually invented to cure some kind of thing. I mean, there was one purpose at first, but at the end of the day, it turned out it works for some other symptoms like like heart disease or some kind of like a cure some symptoms when somebody goes up to the high mountain, something like that. So what I want to say here is like if we are not, we don't have to think of just only to, I mean, limited to like here technical objects to like something tangible and visible. Can we like apply like something biological here, like if we apply something biological to the human body system mechanism, then also we can think of multifunctionality as well. Does it make sense or not?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, the Viagra example is interesting because I haven't really looked into this like independently, but I've seen that some people talk about how Viagra was actually originally developed for menstrual cramps, and for whatever reason, when they were testing the safety of the drug, they had male subjects as well, and that's when they discovered the more well-known effect of Viagra. And then they decided to abandon the menstrual cramps purpose of this drug, and they marketed it as an erectile dysfunction drug. So yeah, in this case, it has multiple functions, but the use of the drug is determined by economic factors of what is most profitable for the manufacturer, and in this case it seems like it's not something I know well, but it seems like the diffusion network is actually sort of restricting the design of this technical object. I think we can treat a drug as a technical object in Simondon's sense. So like the fact that there's this very profitable existing diffusion network of this drug means that the manufacturers have little incentive to research other sort of possible applications of this drug or ways they could modify it to actually maybe address menstrual cramps or the other symptoms that you mentioned, altitude sickness and things like that. I guess, Simondon talks about the positive side of the way that technical objects can be adapted to serve new functions and to be inserted into new networks. But there's probably also a negative side that being inserted into certain types of networks of distribution can mean that a technical object doesn't get developed when it could be.
I'm thinking like it could have to do with like a potential, like a kind of like every technical object has its own potential, which can be revealed or it cannot be revealed like by anyone. Like it depends on like an individual who can find the functions, like further functions. I mean, extra functions of the thing. Kind of like, and also like for example, fork. Like then, when I saw first time, like my friend like uses a fork as a kind of a knife. Like when he cuts like some kind of bread, not bread actually, like the egg fry, like with a fork, not knife. it's kind of like in everyday life, like in quotidian, like in that kind of situation, it's also like a fork. It's not just a fork; it can be used as another kind of a function as well. So I'm thinking in a way like kind of like a Simondonian like a concept, like a potential can be applied to this situation as well.
Yeah, and then so what would be interesting is, if people start using a fork to sort of cut things, and I do this too, use the sort of the edge of the fork instead of getting a knife and having to wash a knife separately. So yeah, you just sort of use the edge of the fork to separate things. But if this starts to become like sort of a widespread practice, maybe fork manufacturers will decide to change the design of the fork so that it has a sharper edge and is better for cutting. And so in this way, the distribution network and the way that the fork is used can feed back onto the design of a fork. Obviously, forks have been around for thousands of years and are not really subject to a lot of design change at this point. But it's always possible that that there can be that sort of feedback from the use of a technical object onto its design.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we're just having for people listening back, we're having a bit of a discussion in the chat here about writing and whether you can learn how to write. And this reminds me of in Plato, I forget which dialogue. Actually, I think it might be a couple of dialogues. There's the whole question of whether you can learn to be virtuous, whether you can teach virtue, and it seems to be. I mean, there's some difficulty with either position because, of course, Socrates holds that virtue is a kind of knowledge of the good, that no one does something wrong voluntarily. You always do what you think is right, even if you might be mistaken in particular circumstances. So if that's the case, if virtue is a kind of knowledge, then it seems that it should be teachable, just like knowledge of geometry or whatever. But then, on the other hand, if you look at the actual practice of the people who claim to teach virtue, namely the sophists, at that time, the results don't seem to suggest that the students of the sophists, or even if we look at today, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that people that study ethics in university are like more virtuous than the rest of us. So why is it the case that this apparent form of knowledge doesn't seem to be teachable or doesn't seem to be? Yeah, Socrates taught Alcibiades, for example, and he was like sort of famous as as being non-virtuous in the Greek sense. Yeah, so like why is it that something that in one respect seems to be a kind of knowledge at the same time doesn't seem to be teachable? And it could be I mean, this is just a suggestion on my part, but it could be that there's a role of creativity in whatever we want to call virtue, in the way that like there are certain moral precepts that you can sort of appeal to or use as inspiration, but at the same time you have to apply them to a concrete situation that was never sort of specifically set out in, like, there's always more circumstances that you can take into account that were never sort of foreseen when those rules were set out. So you have to be able to apply those rules creatively. You have to be able to look at a particular circumstance and say, like, in this situation, doing X is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do because of factors A, B, C. Yeah, so there's a certain amount of creativity involved in being virtuous, and creativity doesn't seem to be something that can be taught, or at least not explicitly taught in the way that knowledge of geometry can be taught. Yeah, exactly. So, like, yeah, Kant's example of the the murderer comes to your door and asks where his victim is, and Kant says you have to tell him. I think most of us would say that that's like a pretty terrible rule if that's what your conclusion leads to. And you should actually infer the opposite. You should use it as a modus tollens, and you should say that if the rule leads to this conclusion, then that is a refutation of the rule. Here, obviously, a certain amount of creativity of maybe lying is wrong in general, but there are circumstances in which lying is preferable to telling the truth. So yeah, you have to have some creative capacity to analyze the situation and figure out what the virtuous course of action is, as opposed to just sort of yeah, just sort of mechanically applying a rule that you already have set for you. And even in Kant, like something like the categorical imperative, whichever formulation you take, is obviously very general principle. Treating people as ends and never as means, for example, doesn't tell you in like a particular situation what exactly you have to do. So that you have to have some actual creativity and thinking to understand like how are you going to apply this general rule to this specific situation. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. If I can get a volunteer to read from the bottom of 177 up to the section break on 178.
I can read a little. All of techniques cannot, of course, be reduced to the production of objects. Numerous techniques amounted and still amount to discovering processes, that is, organizing efficient action according to the postulate of praxeology. However, it is when techniques encounters the object and shapes it, that it constitutes itself as a specific and independent reality able to surpass temporal and cultural barriers. Out of the vast Roman Empire, which was a masterpiece of organization across multiple domains, what has reached us in an active way is what was created as an object: aqueducts, roads, bridges, and houses. If all roads lead to Rome, it is because the Romans of antiquity have invented the construction of roads as stable objects, concretizing the techniques of communication, fast travel, commerce, and transportation, while formalizing the entire reach of the image of power whose seat was Rome, but which drew its sustenance from the provinces through the continuous circulation of things and human beings. This network of objects has survived the empire because it transcended through invention the particular finality of each of its actions and incorporated in nature.
Right, thanks. So that's a much shorter passage than the last one we read. I think this idea of incorporating in nature, I think we can connect this to the passage in Individuation where he talks about the role of the technician as someone who has a relationship with something extra social. I think when we were discussing that passage in when we read Individuation, I think we talked about certain West African communities where metal workers are sort of a separate caste. They live like outside the village. You inherit this profession from your parents, and they like marry within their group and so on. And they have sort of semi-magical powers that other people don't have, and so on. And part of the sort of mystery that surrounds these metal workers is the fact that they precisely have this relationship to metal, this sort of elementary force or elementary component of the world that other people don't have access to. And so other people might have power over people. They might be able to command soldiers, or they might be rich or whatever, but they don't necessarily have power over the natural world in the way that the metal worker does. And so here, like in the case of the Roman sort of technical objects, the bridges and roads and aqueducts, etc. Again, there was this whole social organization that these objects were built to serve. The Roman Empire involved all sorts of distribution of grain and slaves and all sorts of commercial objects and so on. But that whole social organization has disappeared by now, whereas the technical objects that were built to support that social organization, some of them remain. Some of them are even still in use, if I'm not mistaken. And that's precisely because these technical objects are not sort of purely representations or incarnations of social relationships. They serve certain social functions. They are distributed according to certain social relationships, but at the same time they point beyond society or the realm of the social. They sort of appropriate certain powers of the natural world for social uses, and by doing so they sort of bring something natural into the social, or they extend beyond the purely social into the natural. So yeah, I think it's the same type of relationship of sort of this extra social element that gets incorporated into or connected up with a certain social arrangement. that allows for something like a Roman bridge to exist for many centuries after the social arrangement in which it was produced no longer exists.
Yeah, the point about the connection to the extra social is really interesting. After one of our recent sessions, I went back and looked at that section from, I can't remember if it was from the same paper in volume 2 of Individuation, but right before he talks about surrealism, Simondon is talking about poetry, like one of the few times he talks about it. And he says that, I can't remember the name of this Spartan poet he makes fun of, like Tertius or something like that. But he says that every poet is a Tertius of his community, so sort of like an apologist for communal life. And I wonder if Simondon would think that there's any form of art that could have this extra social aspect that the technical object has. I mean, I guess in a way that's still not entirely clear to me, maybe he thinks surrealism has that characteristic as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, my first thought is that art objects incorporate some natural element, or certain art objects. You can think of like a sculpture. You take a piece of marble or block of bronze or whatever, and you part of what you're doing is allowing this natural phenomenon to sort of appear as part of an art object. So you're taking something natural and you're presenting it as an element of an art object. This bit about the role of the poet. I mean, poetry is, or literary art in general. It has maybe a different function in the sense that you're not taking something natural and shaping it or forming it or whatever in the way that sculpture does. And this idea that poetry has this sort of communal function that it sort of glorifies the community in which it exists. It makes me think of the way the Homeric poems, for example. I mean, obviously, we don't know exactly under what circumstances they were composed, but there's a good chance that they were composed as like sort of glorification of a particular lineage of rulers and their claim to title and their sort of legendary history and so on. And they were probably recited at courts and used as a sort of justification for the rule of particular kings. But at the same time, they of course have a value that is sort of exceeds anything that is strictly sort of serving propaganda purposes of one particular society that hasn't existed for 2,500 years or whatever. So this poetic production, I don't know if exactly, it doesn't sort of incorporate the natural in the way that sculpture does, but it sort of reaches beyond a certain social arrangement. It sort of has a value that exceeds that social arrangement that it was produced to serve, and that's part of how it ends up being appreciated and recognized as valuable in many societies that are very different from the one in which it was produced. So yeah, maybe there's like this, whether it's an element of nature or what exactly it is, there's something that great poets are able to capture that is not strictly related to the society in which they find themselves.
Yeah, I guess maybe this goes back to the kind of virtual reserve and Kant thing that we were talking about earlier. Yeah, that's a good example. Like, I mean, there were a lot of like really boring, like Golden Age Dutch paintings of middle class or, wealthy Dutch people, which are uninteresting, but there are also paintings from that era, the ostensive purpose of which, I guess, was just to document somebody's property, but kind of failed to do that in an interesting way that makes them still worth looking at now.
Yeah, exactly. That people like Rembrandt or whoever that like they're probably their self-understanding of what they were doing was depicting some rich guy in a faithful way, capturing or maybe not faithful, but in a flattering way, capturing like their home environment or their office or whatever in a way that shows them as powerful and wealthy and sophisticated and so on. So like their understanding of what they were doing is probably didn't have anything to do with like sort of eternal value or anything like that. But at the same time, these artworks are still things that we can appreciate in a very different society hundreds of years later. And so like by just having this sort of flattery function, but at this so having this flattery function, but at the same time capturing something that goes beyond the specific social arrangements that they are part of, they sort of have this value of being appreciable in other social contexts. It makes you wonder also like what elements of our society today might have like a purely sort of pragmatic function or a largely pragmatic function, or might be used just to show off how rich you are or whatever, and seem not to have any sort of specific sort of intrinsic artistic value. Maybe hundreds of years from now, someone will be able to appreciate it in a completely different social arrangement and find value in it that we don't necessarily recognize today.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's kind of interesting to think about the difference between like, this is a bit of a tangent, but the difference between like the old Dutch painting, which in some cases literally just kind of catalogs all the stuff that a guy owns, and the work of conceptual art, which doesn't say anything about the owner, but is often more or less, whether it's intended to be used this way, just an investment vehicle for a similar type of person.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's a whole world of like using art for money laundering that is pretty interesting, but also pretty like grimy to think about. That you think of art as something that precisely has this eternal value or this value outside of specific like pragmatic purposes. But yeah, so like some people will just buy a painting or some modern work of art and stick it in a warehouse and just like use it to for money laundering, or hope that it appreciates in value and they can resell it. So they're not like buying something because they appreciate its aesthetic worth. They're buying it because they want to use it to make money or to launder their money or whatever. But yeah, like the production of these artworks, that even if they do end up in this sort of gray market or this world of financialized art, those artworks might still be valuable artworks that people will appreciate hundreds of years from now, even if they serve this not very sort of aesthetically oriented function in our society. So yeah, maybe NFTs will be like hundreds of years from now, people will be like appreciating the Bored Apes or whatever.
Yeah, it'll be right up there with Homer and Dante.
Yeah, and so I mean, this I'm joking about that, of course, but this idea of like the capacity for an object, whether it's an aesthetic object or a technical object or whatever it is, to sort of exceed the social circumstances in which it is produced, I think is an important one. So in the case of technical objects, so this is maybe more obvious in the case of technical objects because, of course, you have like think of firearms, for example. Developed in you have gunpowder developed in China in I think like the 9th or 10th century, but it's mostly used for like fireworks and sort of entertainment purposes, if I remember correctly. And then it makes its way to Europe, I think, by some obscure means. It's not really clear how exactly it gets to Europe, and then gets incorporated into weapons use. And so you have like cannons first, but then eventually portable firearms, and then guns get exported all around the world, even to societies that have very little contact with Western Europe, aside from the trade that allows people to get guns. And of course that has huge impacts on like the formation of states in different parts of the world. The people that can get access to guns are much more able to form a military that can conquer territory outside of their home territory, for example. And so this technical object, the gun, is because it sort of incorporates this natural process of chemical combustion, and the metalworking and all these other elements that have to go into it. This allows it to be sort of transported into a variety of different social contexts and societies that are very different from the place where it was created. And so this like diffusion side of things, on the one hand, it sort of inserts a technical object into a social environment in the way that we talked about with the tractor, right? Where the social diffusion of the technical object feeds back onto the design of the technical object. But at the same time, it can have a certain amount of independence from the technical object as well. Like in the case of the gun, where you have like a whole array of societies with different social arrangements, different parts of the world, etc., that are capable of taking this technical object and recognizing what value it has for their purposes, and using it to for different ends in all sorts of different circumstances, and that's sort of independent of the specific functioning of that technical object. So yeah, it's they're like both sides happen probably at the same time, because even with the case of guns, there are obvious adaptations to specific environments. Like certain guns don't work if in humidity, for example. I think I remember reading about the rifles that the American military was using in Vietnam had like they would get sort of warped by humidity, which obviously is not great if you're in like a tropical country. So like if you're using a specific type of gun in a specific climate or specific settings, you might need to adapt it to fit those settings, even if the sort of core functioning of the gun is sort of stable in multiple different settings. So you can have both things going on at the same time, this sort of diffusion in different social environments of one technical object, and this feedback of the circumstances onto the design of the technical object. Okay, so we're at a section break, and I had suggested we do a shorter session today. So and then this next section will take us to the end of the part. So I would suggest that we stop here for today, even though it's a little bit early, if that's okay with everyone.
That works for me.
Yeah, sure. I'm okay with that too.
Yeah, so I think we should finish this part next week, hopefully. It's about 6 pages. And then conclusion might take 2 weeks. I'm not sure, one or 2 weeks. So we have probably about 2 to 3 weeks left of the book. And yeah, so we should think about what we want to read next after this. So we had talked about reading Merleau-Ponty's The Structure of Behavior. So people can take a look at that and see if they're interested in that. But yeah, otherwise you can make any suggestions in the channel on Discord, and we can talk about that. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your contributions and a good discussion, and hope to see you next week.